I think the greatest weapon that the colonizing powers of Canada have used against Indigenous people has been their power to erase them, to make them invisible.
When I get asked this question, what role does my indigeneity play in my artwork? It's almost akin to the same question, how does my intersections, play? My disability, my Franco-Ontarian heritage, my indigeneity, they're all ever present.
This week, we're talking about indigeneity and disability.
Deep conversations, real honest stories, and complex, relevant issues, all examined through a disability lens. This is In Focus.
Hello, I'm April Hubbard. Welcome to In Focus. We're going to kick this episode off by introducing you to a talented disabled Métis artist whose art is bright, full of meaning, and reflects his many identities.
So this hot glue is on the hottest temperature possible. So it kind of melts the packing tape and cellophane.
Michel Dumont is working on his latest wearable art piece, Gagoshe, that's porcupine in Ojibwe, as part of a runway collection for the Indigenous Fashion Arts Festival.
So it's taken me several weeks to make this.
Using a glue gun and packing tape, he's fastening a protective layer of beautiful and brightly colored cellophane porcupine spikes over a Red Riding Hood-style cape made in tribute to the murdered and missing Indigenous women.
I am a queer, Métis, two-spirited disabled artist from Thunder Bay, Ontario. So descendant from the Robertson Superior Treaty area, the Lake Nipigon area. That's where my mother went to school, the Indian Day School at the Lake Helen Reserve. And I grew up just on the north shore of Lake Superior and moved to Thunder Bay.
Michel works with non-toxic and unconventional materials out of necessity.
About 8 years ago, I became a multiple chemical sensitive. And I already had, a back injury. So I was dealing with chronic pain from the age of 29. And so I had to start, thinking about, art projects that were lightweight. But then when I became a multiple chemical sensitive about 8 years ago, I had to start thinking in low toxicity. And then I started playing with lightweight packing tape because the adhesive is fairly non-toxic. And then I realized that I could turn it into a textile. And then I watched Project Runway for the first time. I watched all 14 seasons, I binged watched it all. And the unconventional materials challenge was my laneway. I was just, blown open by the concept that you don't necessarily have to use, materials that, are problematic for yourself. And so I discovered packing tape and cellophane, and that you could shoot light through it, that it had low toxicity. I could breathe with it, in my work environment, and I could live with it. And now I'm doing Indigenous fashion arts, at the Harbourfront Centre next week.
In addition to wearable art, Michel also makes ceramic art pieces, like these stunning taxidermy bear head forms covered in colorful mosaic tiles.
Early on, I thought, well, I should just make art that's pretty. And then I realized that, I had to get personal to become universal. And I had to share, my perspective. When I get asked this question, what role does my indigeneity play in my artwork? It's almost akin to the same question, how does my intersections, play? My disability, my Franco-Ontarian heritage, my indigeneity, they're all ever present. I am, a person of, French descent, of Ojibwe descent through my mother, and the two were intermixed, right? So the tourtière that I grew up making was, from moose meat. And so it was, my mother made moose meat tourtière for her French husband. And so it was this intermingling of two cultures, that, formed my childhood. My Ojibwe grandmother taught me legends and myths. So I carry all of that with me when I make my artwork.
In 2019, Michel performed a piece at Tangled Art and Disability Gallery in Toronto, which centered a photograph from his mother's residential school days.
And so there are children, my mother's age in grade 1, all going to grade 8. And so my aunts and uncles are all in this one-room photo. And the photo, the children's hair are all cut off and there's no one smiling. I recognized the pain in that photograph. I realized that I could take that photograph, I could, put it on a decal, and I could cook it onto the tile that I made. And I realized that I could break the tile with a hammer because it's like a second nature to me. And then I could read out the names of the children while I'm using the hammer blows and breaking the image.
Mariah Adawa, Eddie Wawie.
One of the major themes in my mosaics is making art with a hammer. And living with chronic pain and intergenerational trauma, I found it very cathartic to take my anger and aggression out with a hammer and physically break ceramic tile, and then lovingly put it back together and making something beautiful out of something broken.
Beverly Wawie.
It took me 3 years to do that piece because it was emotionally incredibly difficult to, see the image of my mother at the age of 6, in this difficult environment.
The themes behind some of Michel's work may be based in trauma, but his finished pieces are filled with beauty, brightness, celebration, and joy.
When I was 29, I got sober, and I had to take a lot of therapy, and I had to, learn to live with intergenerational trauma, even though I didn't know that term when I was younger. And I needed to live with light and love. And my artwork can frequently show the darkness and the light. And it is important to me to acknowledge both. So I like making queer, happy artwork, but it has to be something based on something serious, it's informed by trauma. I found my way through it, and I just hope that, other people, see that and appreciate it.
Coming up, Indigenous perspectives on disability.
It wasn't until I started moving off reserve and into the city, into urban centers, that I started experiencing more of, I think, that colonial corrections. Like, this is not how to be.
In Focus will return. You're watching In Focus.
Welcome back to In Focus. Vi Jones is an Anishinaabe Two-Spirit artist, educator, and storyteller originally from Garden River First Nation, just outside colonial Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. They currently live and operate out of Shabuktuk, Halifax, and are finishing their second year in the Master of Art in Arts Education program at NSCAD University. They join me virtually. Welcome, Vi.
Thank you, April, for having me.
So I recently started research into my connections to my Mi'kmaq ancestors and discovered that the colonialist, ableist, capitalist way of understanding disability is very different than what my Mi'kmaq ancestors understood as wellness, ability, and how a person is valued. Can we take a moment to discuss those two perspectives?
I'm not Mi'kmaq, but I'm so lucky to be hosted in Mi'kma'ki. I am Anishinaabe from the territory of Bawating, which is the rapids between the lakes of Superior and Huron. So that is my ancestral home and where I pull my grounded normativity and knowledge from. And from my experience and based around the research that I've done around my master's with community, but also the ways I've experienced sort of growing up within that community, disability is really a colonial context because it presumes that the natural state is human and that human is central to experience, and that human must be able to produce and must be able to work in some way. And so when you have an Indigenous worldview that says you were born into this world of so many others, share the space. You now have human and non-human kin. You have animals and plants that you are encouraged to relate to. Then disability becomes a part of just accommodating difference and accommodating other. Which we can already do when we incorporate, I guess, those ways of thinking, because it's it's disrespectful to expect a deer or bear or fish or tree to be able to do the same things that we as people do. So we need to be able to accommodate the ways that they access space. And then if we bring that purely onto a human level, it's the ways that difference is generative and the way that difference as it makes us more interesting, better people, because it fleshes out all of our aspects of society, as opposed to a colonial model, which is largely punitive, that idealizes this structure of a cisgendered, largely white, largely able-bodied man. And then everything else that doesn't match that is sort of a punitive oppression against it, versus a holistic world being that centers on your relational states and not necessarily the idea of human that you don't match up to.
Yeah. I was really excited when I started this research to have permission from my ancestors to just be who I am and to not need to pretend to be productive on days when I'm not feeling well, to just be in a space and in a time that my body needs. Is that something that you experienced in your early years?
Yes, I was raised with it early on in my life, and for a large part of my life, I didn't question it because I was surrounded by that structure that supported it. But it wasn't until I started moving off reserve and into the city, into urban centers, that I started experiencing more of, I think, that colonial corrections. Like, this is not how to be, this is not how we do things. And every time you push against that, you get immediately corrected back into spot. Like, this is, no, you can't do that. And so for those of us who have a worldview that centers around the way that we engage and relate with the world, now we're being told that that is not how we do things as humans. As humans, we are masters of our environment, and we are not people who need care. We only need care when we are infants, when we are elderly. No, I used to be a baby, and hopefully I will be elderly, and I will have always needed care, and I will always need care. I'm never not going to be in a position where I'm ever independent, no matter how able I am.
Yeah, that's so beautifully put, and a wish that we can all have. In doing my research, I discovered that in Anishinaabe culture, children are often named for the unique gifts that they carry and the responsibilities that they have within their community. How does this set up a culture that focuses on strengths?
If we look at the legacies in which Canada is made permissible, or which Canada defines itself, it defines itself by the idea that this land wasn't being used, or wasn't being used well by the people before, or that there was no one here, or that the Indigenous people here were deficient in some way in structuring their own societies and their own ethics of engagement and their own ways of seeing and engaging with the world, which was based around the worlds we were literally born into. And that goes back to naming. So when I got my name, I was very young at the time, and they told me that this was my gift, and to go out and to learn it. I was very lucky to be named after time of day. And so this is an Indigenous concept of time is completely different, where we engage of cycles, restoring cycles, and that the time of day that I was named after would come every day at a specific time. And when you break down the word that I was named after, it literally breaks down into the past and the present colliding when the sun rises over the horizon. And that is an opportunity for me to find gifts in that, and to relate to that and make meaning from that in my own way, and provide significant self-centering in the world. This is who I am. This is my gifts. These are my purpose. And it also lets you know that you were born into a network of care, because these are gifts from the spirit world. These are gifts from our ancestors. It sets up unknowable others that we are intricately connected and responsible to. And you're encouraged to think about that because you're named after them.
I'm listening to you talk, and it's so exciting to imagine the world in a more expansive way. So thanks for sharing that. We need to take a short break, but there's still lots more to come. My conversation with Vi will continue when we return.
In Focus will be right back. This is In Focus.
Welcome back. I'm talking with Vi Jones about understanding disability through an Indigenous lens. Vi, one thing that I was surprised to learn was that a lot of Indigenous languages don't even have a word for disability because they don't see disability as a concept that needs to be explored. Instead, they focus on a person's strengths rather than their weaknesses.
And the idea of mindful accommodation of difference, that there's no expectation of what or who people are, that people are varied and people are very diverse. Like, you don't have an expectation for you as a human to be able to do the same things across your lifetime. Why would you do that for anybody else?
Very true. So, Vi, Indigenous and disabled folks have historically and still today been forced into sterilization as a form of eugenics. Why do we still allow this to happen in Canada?
I mean, I think the greatest weapon that the colonizing powers of Canada have used against Indigenous people has been their power to erase them, to make them invisible. The idea that there was nobody here before colonizers showed up, the idea that we're still not here, or that colonization has in fact taken over and we're not connected to those languages, those ways of being, as we always have been and have been evolving alongside Canadian citizens in our own ways, still connected to those practices. Like, residential school is horrible. Yes, it didn't work. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is because of the strengths we know within our own communities and the ways that we are unrecognizable to the settler gaze. Those are our strengths.
That's so important to realize. Now, I want to take a moment to recognize the people who have lost their lives as a result of being forced to interact with these Canadian systems. For example, Joyce Akeshwan, the 37-year-old Atikamekw mother of 7, who live-streamed herself being insulted and mocked by staff not long before she died at a hospital northeast of Montreal in 2020. Or Chantal Moore, who was shot to death by Edmundston police while responding to her wellness check in that same year. How can Indigenous people feel safe?
I don't think they can feel safe as long as Canada doesn't care about Indigenous people. Full stop. Like, there's no way that we can be safe if we're constantly under attack, and that's been the legacy since Canadians first self-identified as such. In order for Canada to exist, the land has to be non-Indigenous. And that's the point of a land acknowledgement, right? Is recognizing that this land is Indigenous. It's hosted us since time immemorial. There are fish out there that are well over 160 years old. So what is Canada? It's the idea of people. It's not the land. And so you can find your heart in the land that's not Canada. And that's where you can be safe. But with Canada, you can never be. Because Indigenous identity is a threat to Canadian existence. As long as Indigenous people exist, it will remind Canadians that we were here first. We lived here in harmony, not complete harmony, but we lived here. We had 500 recognized tribes across the US. We had our own customs, languages, and Canada and the US determined that they were not good enough.
Vi, what is your hope for the future?
So I guess my hope for a future that I may be a part of, if we're thinking about my lifetime, is one that builds on an idea that we as people are valuable as we are born, and looks and move towards, I think, a way that addresses and acknowledges what has happened and how we got to where we are, because we are not here by accident and we are not here by the circumstances of fate. We are here by very deliberate choices for very deliberate reasons, and we cannot undo those choices without first talking about them. So we need to acknowledge how we've come to be in the state that we are and what our responsibilities are to each other to move forward in a way that harms the least.
We're going to have to end it there. Thanks for joining me, Vi. I enjoyed speaking with you today.
Thank you for having me.
Indigenous peoples were here long before the settler perspective came along and unsuccessfully attempted to silence their voices by making their existence illegal. These same structures also tried to silence the voice of disabled people through the eugenics movement. It is time we recognize the trauma that these colonial structures continue to cause and shift back to Indigenous ways of understanding the world that celebrates the strengths and beauty that each person brings to our community. That's it for In Focus this week. Thanks for watching.
Host April Hubbard, producer Wendy Purvis, videographers Andrew Pickup, Darcy DeToni, editors Andrew Pickup, freelance camera Tony McGuire, reporter Jillian Gillis, narrator Grant Hardy, media accessibility specialist M. Williams, audio post Mark Phoenix, graphics Mike Smith, opening theme package composed by Matthew Monius for Matt Mac Music, senior producer Michel Dudas, president and CEO David Arrington, copyright 2022, Accessible Media Incorporated.